Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. Government is evil. If you've been following this channel for a while now, you already understand this. If you're new here, well, welcome. Get comfortable and stay a while, because we have a lot to discuss. The damage governments inflict on our liberty has been so thoroughly discussed it's indisputable at this point. But what makes it evil is the knowledge of good and evil demonstrated by the rhetoric of the priesthood of statism. A lion kills a gazelle, but a lion isn't evil because they can't know right or wrong, whereas a politician can. If an individual acted the way governments act, talk as their mouthpieces talked, nobody would tolerate it. Legions of brainwashed fools wouldn't take to the internet to excuse their callous disregard for life, their theft of their neighbor's property, enslaving people into wars of aggression or enforcement of their opinions. Yet billions of people around the world accept the state for doing it. But why though? In my previous video, Smug Statist Libertarian Rebuttal List, me and Esso hypothesized government schooling, which makes sense. The government, especially in Western countries, make it illegal to not send hatchlings to government schools through truancy laws. They're offered at no direct cost to taxpayers. Failing this, parents must send their hatchlings to private schools or charter schools. Parents who do this end up paying twice for schooling, once for private school tuition, and twice through property taxes. Private schools themselves must be evaluated and approved by state agents. Homeschooling exists, but homeschooling parents must still meet education requirements set by their state. In the US, homeschooling requirements vary depending on locality and can be very lax or demanding portfolio reviews, whatever the hell that means, and standardized testing. In Australia, homeschoolers need to register with the government. In Israel, homeschoolers must beg the Ministry of Education for permission to teach their own hatchlings, and in Germany, it's illegal altogether, due to legislation passed in 1938 under the argument that homeschooling was subversive and anti-nationalistic. Don't be so surprised that modern German government honors literal Nazi legislation. But I'm getting off topic. The majority of hatchlings are in government schools, where the state directs them what to study, how long to study it, where they should study it, and how to think about it, all the while being lectured to by state agents whose very careers depend on pieces of paper awarded to them by other state agents for proper compliance and obedience. This is known as the Prussian model of education, designed by Johann Fichte in the 19th century to prevent hatchlings from thinking and acting as otherwise their schoolmasters would have wished. Since government legislation mandates hatchlings to attend government schools headed by government agents to teach government propaganda, why is anyone surprised they think government is good, especially if they have their attention for 40 hours a week? Of course it contributes to people's perceptions of government. Anyone who ignores this is clearly making a mistake. However, upon further reflection, it isn't sufficient. Now, normalcy bias factors in as well. People have lived under governments for generations. How the state plunders from you isn't immediately obvious either, and when it is visible, as is the extent to which they tyrannize you through legislation, people can't connect the plundering or tyrannizing to the state, or even just assume it's for a good cause. Without the government, who will wipe my ass? But how come people can't make these connections? Well, we're back to education, aren't we? But you might be thinking, if the indoctrination argument explains why people support the existence of government and explains the normalcy bias, how come it is insufficient? Well, historically, government schooling is actually very rare. Government education was limited to either nobility, such as in ancient China, or highly militarized societies such as ancient Sparta. The overwhelming majority of people, prior to and throughout most of the 19th century, were taught through community or private education, if at all. It's only through the mass adoption of the Prussian model in the West around the 19th and early 20th century, government schools have been a thing for 120 years, whereas governments have been a thing for 5,500 years. So there has to be a better explanation. Well, I found it. The reason is a problem too few people in society are willing to talk about. While the most oppressed minority in history and today is the individual, without question, a close second most oppressed minority is the hatchling. Take a moment and think about how hatchlings are treated in today's society. The majority of hatchlings are raised in households where physical force is employed. According to the University of Texas, 83% of kids in the US were physically punished by their parents before they entered 5th grade of government schooling. So at about 10 years old, the people who the hatchling looks up to for love, care, and attention are hitting them, even justifying it to themselves, so of course they have to. In 2012, 70% of parents said it's okay to spank. That is to say, striking a child's buttocks with an open palm. A study of 20,000 kindergartners and their parents found numbers varied by race, with blacks being the highest at 89%, and whites and Asians at 73%, reporting that it's sometimes necessary to give a child a good, hard spanking. Perhaps even more heartbreaking are the parents who know full well they should never spank kids but do so anyway. Keep in mind, these are the parents of kindergartners, kindergarten, kids, hatchlings as young as 5, and the majority of parents think it's okay to assault them. Hatchlings are moral agents. I can't believe I have to mention this. They can demonstrate self-ownership, and that's what this is, assault. They have the same rights of bodily integrity as anyone else, and are no less a victim of assault because they are 4 years old. Aggression is aggression, whether it's an open swat on the ass or a closed fist to the face. So, why do parents do this? Parents who hit their kids give plenty of justifications. Among the most common are that it gets their hatchlings to listen, or to conform their behavior to the parents' preferences, if only to avoid being hit in the future. However, all this really does is teach them to avoid being hit. There's no evidence whatsoever that using physical violence ensures compliance for longer than 10 minutes, or causes the victim to internalize justification for desired behavior. So this argument in favor of hitting kids is useless. Parents might argue that they were hit and they turned out okay, but clearly this is not the case if they regard committing violence against other moral agents to be acceptable. But even ignoring this, spanking is associated with higher risks of aggression. Increased antisocial and depressive behaviors can lower a child's IQ and has been linked to a reduction of gray matter in the brain. Gray matter being associated with sense perception, memory, muscle control, learning, and emotions. Spanking literally damages brain growth. Of course, there's no direct causal relationship, merely an increased risk. Chain smokers can live up to 80 to 90 years, it's not a sure thing. Much like how smoking puts the smoker at a higher risk for emphysema or lung cancer, spanking puts the victim at a higher risk of increased aggression or depression. Just think of it this way. If you're a parent and you know that you can protect your hatchling from suffering literal brain damage just by not hitting them, wouldn't you? I mourn the people these parents could have been had they not been spanked. I mourn the person I could have been too. Now, another argument is that nothing else seems to work. But this begs the question, what else was tried? There are many options available, and given that internet access is ubiquitous, there's a trove of information available to everyone, including parenting message boards and websites. This isn't merely a confession of parental incompetence, but in this day and age, of parental laziness, neither of which affirm the merits of violence as a means of encouraging conformity. Ultimately, the goal of corporal punishment is to encourage hatchlings to conform to parents' standards of preferable behavior. Now, many behaviors are preferable. Not stealing, not shouting, not hitting, sharing. But how do they teach this to their kids? Well, if they can't convince them in other ways, or the parent is in a bad mood, what do? Realize that either their morals are faulty, identified from a perspective they may not have considered? Improve their ability to articulate their point of view so their kids will internalize the justification for their ideas? No! they'll hit them, either with a spank or a closed fist or, God forbid, with an implement, in order to get the kids' compliance. They use violence. But what are the hatchlings actually learning? All they are learning is blind obedience to the parents' authority, and authority belongs to those who use violence. To get their way, they need to use violence. In order to feel better, they need to use violence. Since kids can learn cause and effect as young as 3 months old, they learn to sit down, shut up, and comply with the demands of those who wield violence because they wield violence. Sure, hatchlings will lash out, especially if hitting them makes them more aggressive, but they're acting out what was inflicted upon them through the lessons taught to them by their parents and attempting to assert dominance. Each time they do so, they may be hit or scolded that it's wrong for them to use violence. Through repetition, they learn that to avoid negative feelings from being hit or scolded, they must obey. They must suppress their thoughts, their realization that their overlords are hypocrites for using violence to assert that violence is wrong. Of course, what these parents forget is that if they rule through fear, it only works as long as the child fears them. It's indoctrination, all right, just not government schooling. Indoctrination into the principles that underlie statism, that those who wield violence decide what's right. Who wields the most violence is the most righteous, and violence is its own justification. The state, therefore, is right because it is the most violent, and if hatchlings want power, they must be more violent than their rivals. We can see this among serial killers, who are significantly more likely to have been victims of childhood abuse than the general population, whether it be physical, sexual, or psychological. Now, of course, child abuse isn't a recent phenomenon. In fact, historically, the care and attention we get to hatchlings and actually recognizing the immorality of child abuse is a recent phenomenon in history. It was only in the 80s and 90s that emotional child abuse was acknowledged. In the 70s, sexual abuse was acknowledged to exist. It took the publishing of the Battered Child Syndrome in 1962 before physical child abuse was officially recognized, just 57 years ago. The first child abuse criminal case in North America involved a 9-year-old named Mary Ellen. She was beaten badly and malnourished by her parents, so much so that a church worker brought the case to government authorities, but was turned away. When she brought it to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, they took the case, and they won, arguing on the grounds that hatchlings were part of the animal kingdom and therefore deserving of the same legal protections. I don't know if you caught that, but the argument of the ASPCA against child abuse is that hatchlings are animals too. I mean, don't get me wrong, animal cruelty is an abhorrent thing, but that the state would protect animals before it would protect kids, and you can only protect kids by arguing that they are animals too, that's unforgivable. This was in 1873, by the way. America was approaching its first century of nationhood, whereas Western legislation had been in place in colonial North America for centuries. I should mention as well that science had no idea that infants felt pain until 2015, just 4 years ago. Things get worse the further back you go. In the 17th century, for instance, bad hatchlings were left alone in dark closets, drawers, and left without food for hours, even days at a time. Beatings were still common, and mothers often complained of being unable to make 4-month-old babies quiet after beating them black and blue, stating that they won the battle, as though violence were a contest of wills against a baby. Hatchlings were also made to witness public executions and the rotting cadavers of those hanging from gibbets, all to terrorize them into compliance. And the 17th century was an innovation over the 13th century, as the former saw the rejection of the idea that hatchlings had to be beaten like clay. In the 13th century, hatchlings were previously regarded as demonic, who would turn into changelings, that is to say supernatural parasites who suck the life out of mothers, unless they were given regular beatings, often with a variety of instruments deliberately designed to prick, bruise, and batter. Concern with the child's well-being extended only as much as they weren't killed. Young hatchlings were commonly exposed to rampant sexual abuse by peers, authority figures, and parents, if they weren't outright abandoned to wet nursing, monasteries, or nunneries. Going even further back, we find ancient civilizations committing atrocities on their most vulnerable. Ancient Carthaginian graveyards were filled with underground urns containing the remains of tens of thousands of hatchlings sacrificed by their parents to the gods so that they would grant them favor. Old census records show boys outnumbered girls 4-1, suggesting gender-favored infanticide, and primitive societies are even worse, with the modern-day tribes of New Guinea and the Australian Aboriginals engaging in rampant sexual molestation of their kids. And those are the lucky ones who aren't cannibalized by their mothers. The extent of how child abuse reflects in societal violence can be seen in how the majority of Aboriginal men are killed in homicides, with a quarter dying in warfare, both in Aboriginal tribes and in other primitive societies today. 40% of Mesolithic human remains died in violent deaths, going up to 60% of deaths from warfare for modern-day Amazon tribes. All of the sources for this will be below. I would encourage you to look through them yourself because I promise you, I am only scratching the surface. Child abuse isn't the exception of history, it's the norm. Things have gotten better over time, and we can't discount the progress that we've made, but let's call a spade a spade. The foundation of the state is domination, predation, terror, and violence. I couldn't possibly say when it began, but once society internalized this praxis of might makes right and inflicted it on their kids, all that was required for states to form was for bandit gangs to conquer villages and declare themselves a government. What ability would the people have to resist, arguing natural law, negotiation, voluntary exchange, when such was never demonstrated to them in their youngest years? No. What happened is that a group of men who called themselves government simply played out the role of the parent of society. A parent to be obeyed, and a parent that will punish or even kill the bad child society. The state will often reinforce this, describing the individual-government relationship as paternalistic. The Soviet Union described its conflict with the Axis powers as defending the motherland. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany referred to itself as the fatherland. Adolf Hitler himself was repeatedly battered into a coma by his father. The term patriot describes someone in support of their country and countrymen. The term derived from Greek patris or fatherland, alternatively from patrios, of one's fathers. The basic army units of foot soldiers, of infantry, are called upon by the fatherland to die for the politician parents' pet causes. A free society is one in which social relations are based on negotiation, cooperation, and voluntary association. Does anything of what I described in the last thousands of years resemble peaceful negotiation or cooperation? You already know the answer to that. Since many primitive societies previously mentioned lack formalized governing bodies, even lacking tribal chiefs, they cannot be said to have governments. Yet they still treat their young with barbarity. So claiming that child abuse causes states or statism has no basis in observable reality. This also refutes the inverse, that states cause child abuse, since primitive societies are pre-state, as does the evidence of violent deaths for 40% of human remains recovered from the Mesolithic era, millennia before the first states even formed. States haven't taken hold only because society is too barbaric even for governments. Leaders do form these tribes, but if they exercise governing authority, they are simply killed on the spot. Any organizing attempt is also doomed to fail, as societal distrust is too high. The formation of states is independent of child abuse, but make no mistake. The state perpetuates itself off the trauma of battered kids. If parents simply negotiated with their hatchlings, the question of liberty versus tyranny would lack much of the emotional energy defending it. Traumatized victims wouldn't defend their insecure attachments to their parents, proxied by the state. The religion of statism would be limited to the lies forced upon them in government school, which is already regarded with contempt by students even today. The real lessons on the legitimacy of the state aren't in classrooms. They're in the swatting palms and verbal tirades of parents. A voluntary society begins at home. Kids are a lot smarter than we often give them credit for, and even toddlers understand how things like bribery works. Practice negotiation with them. Don't try to domineer them into good habits. Help them understand why they should. This isn't permissive parenting, as some would argue. I mean, for God's sake, any dog trainer will tell you don't hit your dog. It's just going to make them aggressive or fearful. Why do we treat animals better than our own flesh and blood? I mean, it's cowardly too. Hitting kids too small and weak to fight back. Isn't it interesting how most guides on spanking will tell you to stop hitting after they start hitting their teenage years? It can't be because they're able to fight back, is it? Anyways, if you're interested in learning ways to raise kids without violence, there's plenty of resources online. I'll provide a link down below to a site called peacefulparenting.com that should give you some good advice from parents to parents. We can do better. We don't have to indoctrinate our own hatchlings with the belief that authority comes from being the strongest and most violent. If we can't treat our offspring at least as well as we treat our pets, then you know what? Maybe we deserve statism. Questions, comments, critique? What do you think about a child abuse and statism connection? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.
So here's the very first edition of Patreon Questions. This is a new segment for anyone who donates to this channel's Patreon with $2 a month or more, is on the Backalley Discord server and comments asking for a patron role and leaves questions in the patron-exclusive Patron Questions channel. If you want a chance for any question you may want to ask to be answered directly at the end of any future videos, all you need to do is follow the aforementioned steps. Anyway, first question from Bob's Boogaloo, as he's known at the time of this video's upload. How do you argue against egoists? They will just say rights are fake. Well, not to spoil anything, but I've actually been planning on making an essay on the problems with general moral nihilistic philosophy and its premises regarding human action on a fundamental level. So I'm not going to respond to this question with as much detail as I could or would like to go into for the time being. But basically, to argue that objective ethical truths can't exist is inherently paradoxical, because this claim itself is asserting that an ethical truth claim is objectively demonstrable, as in order to argue any sort of ethical philosophy or ethical first principles, you need to be able to construct a truth claim regarding the objective nature of ethics. Anyway, that's all for today's video. If you liked it, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.